Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll begin in a minute or so. We'll just let people log in from wherever they are. Okay, terrific. We'll go ahead and get started, and folks can join as they log on. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kara Carmack, the Assistant Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs at the New York Studio School, and I'm honored to welcome you to our Fall 2024 Evening Lecture Series. We are thrilled to welcome Mai Eldib this evening and a discussion of modern art movements in Egypt and Iraq. This season is particularly special as the New York Studio School is celebrating our 60th anniversary this year. Please stay tuned for many exciting events coming up related to our 60th celebrations, including a Morton Feldman concert that will take place at the Studio School on Wednesday, October 9th. I recommend that you get your tickets soon. Space is limited. We'll be offering exclusive tours of our historical spaces on Friday, October 18th as part of Open House New York for those of you who are in New York or planning to visit in October. And our annual benefit dinner and auction will take place at the school on Thursday, October 24th, honoring our Dean Emeritus, Graham Nixon, for his 36-year tenure as Dean. Details of all of this and more can be found on our website and in our monthly newsletter. For this evening's program, we'll reserve time at the end for Q&A. So feel free to submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll ask them. The New York Studio School is grateful to the following funders for the support of the 2024-25 Evening Lecture Series: the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and many generous individual contributors. I'm delighted to introduce our guest this evening. Mai Eldib is an art advisor and a cultural strategist. She worked for Sotheby's for 16 years as Senior Vice President of the Middle East. She played an instrumental role in providing a platform for promoting modern and contemporary Arab, Turkish, and Iranian art. Her latest project was supporting the Egyptian Pavillion at the 2024 Venice Biennale, represented by Wael Shawky, entitled Drama 1882. Eldib received her BA in Political Science and Middle Eastern Studies from Barnard College, and she currently sits on the MENAC Guggenheim Acquisition Committee, the Friends of Magdi Yacoub Heart Foundation, and MASS Alexandria. She was recognized by Apollo magazine in the top 40 under 40 in the art business world in 2019, and she recently published a book with Assouline entitled Cairo Eternal just last year. Mai, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be with you guys. Well, thank you so much for having me, Kara, and thank you for your patience in putting this all together. I know it wasn't easy to get it all set up, but thank you so much. Hi everyone. I'm gonna talk there's a lot of content and a lot of information that I'm going to be sharing, so I'm going to try to run through it as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and as clearly as possible. Please feel free to ask as many questions as you want and as many questions as you need. I sometimes take for granted what people might know and what they might not know, because I've been working in this for a very, very long time, as I was mentioning to Kara. I'm going to touch upon two movements that are very, very important in the Arab world, two movements in the modern Arab art world, one in Egypt and one in Iraq, and they're both predating the 1960s. They're very, very interesting periods, I think, because when we come talk about them, they both are occurring during a colonial time period in both respective countries, as well as a monarch during their monarchies. And in the lead up, they both end up being revolutionary countries with coups, etc. So, so just a bit of history, if you didn't know. Egypt, the Art and Liberty movement, which is the one we're going to be touching upon, which is the image on your left, was a movement that was founded in 1938 to 1948. Egypt at the time was still considered an extension. At the time, the Ottoman Empire had dissolved, but it was part of the former Ottoman Empire, and the kingdom was the lineage of the Ottoman Empire. And the same holds in Iraq, also a former Ottoman Empire, part of the former Ottoman Empire. And in the 1950s, the Baghdad Modern Art Group is founded, 1951, which is the image presented on your right. And that was during the Hashemite Kingdom, and post that is the revolution that eventually ended up being another revolution leading us to the Ba'ath Party. So, the Art and Liberty Movement, it was founded in 1938 to 1948 in Cairo by a thinker known as George Henin. They published a manifesto, interestingly, in December 22, 1938, with 36 signatories. The signatories were mainly writers, thinkers, artists, filmmakers, etc. And the manifesto was entitled "Long Live Degenerate Art." The movement was known as in French, because it was mainly all the content that was created was in French and in Arabic. L'Art et Liberté and جماعة الفن والحرية to those who speak Arabic. Many of the co-signatories to the manifesto were Albert Kossari, Obsessionen, Ibrahim Wasili, but the main founder was George Henin. And George Henin was the son of a diplomat and had a different sort of exposure. And it was known that in 1936, he met with André Breton in Paris, one of the founders of the global surrealist, or one of the most important leading figures in the global surrealist movement in Paris. Throughout the 10 years from 1938 to 1948, the group hosted 5 seminal exhibitions throughout Cairo, and with many individuals scattered throughout. As you can see below, I have I don't know if I can zoom. I forget. I'm not zooming. I apologize. But this is a copy of the manifesto. Basically, this was distributed throughout Cairo in 1938, and this is the manifesto. Essentially, it was a denunciation against the attack by the Nazis and other fascist parties on modern art in Europe, and the manifesto was hailing degenerate art. What we saw in 1930 and what was happening across Europe. It used the pretext of what happened in the Degenerate Art exhibition in Munich as a trigger. And basically the manifesto says, Vive l'art dégénéré, Yahya al-Fann al-Mulhat, long live degenerate art. And it was a cultural statement for Egypt and for the West, where they saw that there was a collapse in Europe for fascist regime and hyper-nationalist regimes, and the cultural scene in Egypt at the time was thriving and allowing for this, for artists to participate, for artists to paint, to think, with a lot of freedom of expression and freedom of thought. and where they saw in Europe this sort of standstill. And I'll just read you a part of the text, and it says, "We believe that any
One moment. It appears that Mai has, um, her internet's decided to not cooperate today. We'll give her a moment to reconnect.
I think I lost you guys in a second. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. You were just about to read us some text from the manifesto.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just sharing my screen again.
Sure.
Sorry, everyone. Uh, and basically it concludes that we stand for degenerate art, and it is that it resides all the chances of the future. Let us work for its victory and the Middle Ages, which is rising in the very heart of the Occident. The group was extremely, they were a group of liberators, and they believed Egypt could nurture this dream of liberation, freedom of expression, and was very much enshrined in these ideas of socialist beliefs and abolishing all kinds of classist and sort of caste societies. Egypt at the time was a monarchy. There was a very present aristocracy, so it was also very much against that premise. Also, to give context to those who also have some background in art history, in the early year of 1938, this manifesto was signed and distributed in December 1938. March 1938, Filippo Martinetti, the Italian philosopher, presented his pro-colonial perspectives in Cairo, and which clashed aggressively with a lot of big generation of Egyptian artists and intellectuals. In this, I'm going to touch upon three artists that we see that had exhibited and had been part of this movement. And this is also one of the thoughts of Georges Hennin, the founders. We believe that the mere idiocy and folly to reduce modern art as some desire to a fanaticism for the particular religion or race. They were extremely against it. It's sort of, just to give you context, it was imagined like the celebration of absolute freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and all of that. Below is an example of the first exhibition that they held in Cairo, and at the time it was very, very radical. The first exhibition was held in February 1940 at the Nile Gallery in downtown Cairo. And it was a departure from the scene that existed in Egypt at the time, which was very romantic art, idealized by the Egyptian pioneer artists known as Mohamed Nagy, Georges Sabbagh, and Mahmoud Said. They were very French classical painters trained in that style. And these young artists sort of garner more attention and garner more sort of cachet, had asked Mahmoud Said, who was at the time one of the most celebrated Egyptian artists. And as you can see, this is the painting they asked him to loan to the exhibition, La Femme au Boucle d'Or, which is the woman with the golden locks. It was painted in 1933, and I go back, you can see that it was part of the first brochure. And this was the painting that one of the paintings that we know for sure was in the first exhibition. The painting is presently part of the collection of Mathaf, the Museum of Modern Arab Art in Doha in Qatar. It is probably one of the only examples where we see Mahmoud Said have pseudo elements of surrealism in his paintings. And it's very interesting, but it's not really emblematic of what the whole group was painting. The other paintings I wanted to touch upon were the works of Ramses Younen, for example. Ramses Younen was one of the founders, was one of the signatories. He was also one of the contributors to the magazines that were associated with the art and freedom movement. As you can see here, a very typical surrealist work, very much on par with everything that you could have seen in a global surrealist exhibition. Kara and I were discussing this group was also very, very special since they had there was a massive retrospective on this group that was hosted at the Centre Pompidou in 2016 and subsequently traveled to the Tate Liverpool, Reina Sofia in Spain, K20 in Dusseldorf, Moderna Museet in Sweden, and I think those are 5 museums. So there was a massive show retrospective for this group, and I think this also shed light and allowed them to be part of the Beyond Borders, the global surrealist show that was at the Tate and the Metropolitan. Ramses Younen being one of the artists that was included. Younen, so the three artists exactly that I'll touch upon are Younen and Tilmiseni. And a lot of the works that they did were referencing, they were very much feminists also, these artists. So they were referencing these distorted women to shed light on the situation of women, because during colonial Egypt, you had a big scene where in downtown Cairo, where the soldiers were seen to solicit a lot of prostitution, prostitutes in the bars of Cairo. So that was sort of also their statement against that happening all throughout Cairo. This is another example by Ramses Younen called Against the Wall, which is currently in the Museum of Modern Art in Cairo. And then in 1960, later on, post the movement, which usually it has its major end in 1948, Younen moves to complete abstraction, and this is something we see from a lot of these artists that were part of the art and liberty movement, where they start out as being hyper surrealists and very much obsessed with the surrealism, with the themes that we see in surrealism, but later on they moved towards abstraction. Cairo at the time, there was a lot of from 1930 to 48, there was a big income disparity, which also we can see up to this day. They sort of wanted to be seen as representing the underprivileged or those who did not have a voice, and explored a lot of themes of poverty and equality that they saw at its height during 1938 to 48. This is also the brochure for the second exhibition that happened, and as we can see, there was Ramses Younen, Inji Aflatun, Amy Nimr, also a very fascinating artist. One of the artists that you all might be acquainted with that exhibited with this group was Lee Miller, the photographer. And there's actually right now a movie by Kate Winslet, and showing also her time in Cairo and when she was photographing Cairo and creating surreal photographs of Cairo. This is an example of the group at one of the exhibitions, with George Henin at the far left, the founder, and Ramses Younen at the far right. And then this is another artist who I will touch upon, known as Kamel Tilmiseni. Kamel Tilmiseni was one of the very interesting artists also, but there's very little known about him. We have a couple of paintings that we see that he painted, but other than that, he leaves Egypt in the 60s and lives in exile in Lebanon. But but he sort of painted only from 1938 to 1942. He was sort of a Renaissance man as well, political activist, a poet, artist, and a self-taught artist in the sense that he went to veterinary school and didn't have any formative education in the art world. And a lot of his paintings had this shock value, and it was super grotesque. And he had this like goriness and harshness to the reality. And he famously said, "Blackness, bold, ripped shapes, and sad screaming lines are the only images prescribed to the artist by a non-bourgeois world in which a maimed humanity lives." He stopped working after the fourth show and moved towards filmmaking. And he wrote and directed a very, very important movie in Egyptian cinema called Al-Suq Sauda, The Black Market, which is considered to be the first neorealist movie in the Middle East and was one of the top 100 movies in the 20th century Egyptian cinema. And unlike other members of the movement, he stops post-surrealism, and we don't really see him explore abstraction as an artist, and we see him become a filmmaker. And the examples here we have of his work, and you can see that there's always this element of bestiality that we see in his paintings and his work. Husseini was part of Liberty movement, art and liberty movement, and one of his students is one of the most celebrated artists living right now. Is my connection still okay? One of his students was Ingi Aflatun, who is one of the most celebrated artists in Egypt. She was one of the youngest artists to participate with the art and liberty movement. Her painting is entitled "The Girl and the Beast." It was part of the second or third exhibition. It's currently housed in the Museum of Modern Art. Ingi painted this when she was just 17, if I'm not mistaken. I find her to be one of the most fascinating Egyptian artists, and she had a super long history. She's also the only Egyptian artist to have been imprisoned for her political beliefs. She was a staunch communist, and she was put in jail in the early 60s and late 50s, early 60s, and was released in the early 60s because at the time Egypt was believed in socialism. And but she, even during the time while she was in jail, she was able to produce some of her most interesting and fascinating art from her jail period. This is an example of an artwork portrait of a prisoner in 1963. This artwork is currently on show at Venice Biennale in the General Gardini Pavilion. And this is a painting of Ingi Aflatun with her in her studio in the background. And this is an example of an auto-portrait called Al-Ahlam Al-Mu'taqala, which are basically called, translates to dreams of a detainee. Ingi was taught by Kamil Misani, hence the connection. She was a super avant-garde artist. She was brought up in a very, very aristocratic background, very bourgeois, and she resented it. She became very militant, and she found out that there's a huge
One moment, we'll welcome her back.
what is happening.
There we are.
Kara, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
you're back.
I'm sorry. I don't know. It didn't happen. It didn't happen while we were testing, and now it's happening.
Right.
I apologize. I don't know why this is happening.
That's okay.
I'm sorry, everyone.
Yeah, so if you want to reshare your
on the
screen.
topic, yeah, we're on Ingi. So yeah, can everyone?
Beautiful.
Yes.
Yes.
So as I was saying, she was a student of Kamil Misani and one of the youngest artists to have participated in the art and liberty movement. And she became extremely militant in her thoughts. And she's in an interview when asked why she embraced communism, and she says, "I became very militant and began to question why is there such a big difference between rich and poor. At first, I was an anarchist in my views, and then Marxism became my guide for social solutions." And she felt it was necessary to join the cause in solidarity with the Egyptian working class, which she found that lived very unfair, like she lived very unfairly, given the fact that she lived in a very bourgeois lifestyle. Also, her biggest struggle was the fact that she was educated in French and she spoke French, and she found the fact that she was unable to communicate in Arabic highly problematic and highly bothersome for her. And that's why we see throughout a lot of her paintings this representation of the Egyptian peasant. Uh, Though she was put in jail for 5 years, which was very, very uncommon at the time. When she was released from her incarceration, she still found that she wasn't upset about it, and she still was able to work and create probably one of her most interesting bodies of works while she was in prison. The second group I really wanted to touch upon was the Baghdad Modern Art Group. I think a lot of us don't recognize the breadth and the wealth of knowledge that existed in Iraq at the time prior to 1960. Uh, and this is something very interesting. In the 1950s, Frank Lloyd Wright was commissioned to sort of build the Greater Baghdad, the plan of Greater Baghdad, and the plan for Greater Baghdad entailed a cultural center, an opera house, all and universities within Baghdad in 1957 to 1958. And it was a very, very ambitious plan to be built throughout the city. Sadly, however, as the kingdom had collapsed in 1958, the project stopped, came to a halt, and was never built. In the image here, we can see Muhammad Makkiyah. Muhammad Makkiyah was one of the most important collectors, book collectors, and architects. Jawad Selim, who is the gentleman with the beard, who is who was part of one of the founders of the Baghdad Modern Art Movement, Frank Lloyd Wright, the gentleman in the hat, Rifat Shadirji, who is an architect, Mahmoud Sabri, who is an artist as well, who is not part of the movement, who ended up living in exile for the rest of his life, but probably also one of the most interesting Iraqi modernist artists of the time. The Baghdad Modern Art Group, جماعة بغداد للفن الحديث. The Baghdad Modern Art Group was founded by Jawad Selim, an artist writer, and his other friend also, Sheikh Hassan al-Said, in 1950s. Both of them were from the first movement also that existed in Baghdad, the Rawad or the pioneers. Also, to give context, the Hashemite kingdom was a short-lived kingdom for 38 years, and this was towards the end of the kingdom. The kingdom lost power in 1958, where it was overthrown by a coup. The coup sort of was emulating the coup that happened in Egypt in 1952. The 1958 revolution was led by Abdel Karim al-Qasim and the free officers. They got a lot of their ideas from Egypt at the time, from the Nasser coup, and it was built on pan-Arabism, the revolution, unifying the Arab world, and we can see but it was very factionalized, and this revolution also fell through in the late 60s. What makes the Baghdad Modern Art Group interesting is that they wanted to create a vernacular that was unique to Iraq. They wanted to really, really embrace something a language that would sort of mesh and mold their cultural identity and their cultural heritage. And this is part of their manifesto. And them, like the art and liberty movement in Egypt, we have another movement called the contemporary art movement, the Jamaat al-Fan al-Hadith, the contemporary art group, which followed the art and liberty movement, and the Casablanca School. They're possibly the only four manifestos that we knew about and the four collectives that defined as groups that came out, not sort of artists in limbo, but they were concrete groups with shows that they came together and they exhibited together. And they're part of the manifesto. It read, "We dream that there's a dream that connects us with all the beings that simply dream, a dream we call Baghdad." And here are some of the examples that we see by Sheikh Hassan al-Said, who's one of the founders of the group. They're very, very interesting. Sheikh Hassan also evolves into abstraction like the surrealists in Egypt. And that's something I find interesting, so that in the sense that they are connected in that. Here as you can see, they try to trace a lot of the elements that they found in ancient Iraqi culture, whether it's Mesopotamia or Islamic culture, the Abbasid culture. The painting on the right, known as the Bustan al-Ma'rifa, the orchard of the orchard of knowledge, which I find very interesting because the Abbasid period and Harun al-Rashid, which is probably one of the most important periods of the Islamic Empire, and references the libraries that used to exist in Baghdad at the time. And I'm sure if you guys know anything, there's this very famous saying in the Middle East, Cairo writes, Beirut prints, and Baghdad reads, because the Iraqis were known to be voracious readers and always trying to consume everything and as much as possible. Sorry if I'm sharing so much so quickly, Kara. I hope that it's not. I hope it's all going. Everyone's getting everything.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
I know it's a lot and it's political and it's just all over the place, but I hope people are making sense of it. This is another example. These are another two examples that we have of Sheikh Hassan Said. In 1951, this is when they really start. They start really exhibiting in Baghdad, and we see that they use a lot of cubist elements and referencing things that we see also that are part of the global art world. And they become part of this new generation, and they believe in going back to their heritage. And that's the consensus that both Sheikh Hassan al-Said and Jawad Salim trace. They sought to consciously reinvent and modernize the aesthetic by being inspired but not bound by their past. Their work managed to merge the local and the folk and traditional imaginaries. So even though it might be for many people who see this, they don't really see this as being hyper contemporary and 1950s work. It was a complete departure from what they had. The Roued were before them, were extremely classically trained, sort of in a Barbizon style. So for them, this was a huge departure at the time. The group's task was sort of to reform the artistic development and the modernist discord in Baghdad from 1949 to 1954. The other artist that is very interesting from the Baghdad Modern Art Group is Jawad Salim, and his aim was to, and this is a quote by his wife about him. His wife was English, Lorna Salim. His aim was to create an artistic language unique to Iraq, built on the great art of its past civilization, the Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and of course the Islamic civilization, but in the language of the 20th century. I'm sure if you watch the news frequently and if you watched what was happening during the Iraq War, this was Nasb al-Hurriya, which was basically the national freedom Nasb al-Hurriya, which was the freedom platform in Maidan al-Tahrim, Freedom Square. This was a work that was seminal and very much part of the Baghdad modern art movement. Nasb al-Hurriya, this is an image of it, completed in 1961. It was done by Jawad Salim and Rifat Shaderji, who we saw in the first slide with Frank Lloyd Wright. And this is another image of it. And this is a more contemporary image of it. And I'll just state at that. it's a very, very important work, and it's the largest monument that was built in the Iraqi history, the last 2,500 years, and sort of explained the new dawn in Iraq and reflective of the Iraqi people. And he worked in partnership, as I mentioned, with the architect in Rifat Chadirji. This was commissioned in 1959 in the new Republic of Iraq following the revolution, and was seen as a celebration of Iraq not being in the shackle of colonialism. They wanted it to symbolize the Abbasid and the Babylonian culture, but yet to be strikingly modern. The aim was for it to be read like a poem, an Arabic poem, from right to left. So you can see these reliefs, major reliefs, multiple references, referencing Arabic poetry, things that happened in the revolution and sort of the independence, and a new dawn and a new scene in Iraq. And as you can see here, and I'm sure you guys have seen it a lot in the news. The reason I touched upon these two movements is simply because we don't really always look at let's say the Middle East in the sense as being a modern region with a rich history. And something that I always see and I always read is that there isn't enough primary sources, but a lot of the primary sources are sadly not translated in English, and a lot of the primary sources also exist only in Arabic or in French. So when it comes to studying this region, it becomes very, very difficult if you don't have access to the Arabic language and you don't have access to primary resources. And most of these primary resources aren't easily accessible in libraries per se. So I think what makes it very, very tricky to really research these artists or to really research these movements is the lack of translated documents for it. There's been a huge shift, as I was mentioning to Kara before our talk, for the need to have exhibitions to showcase these movements. The show that was in the Pompidou in 2016 did a lot for the art and liberty movement, the Egyptian art and liberty movement, putting it in the general art historical canon on surrealism, which was a huge movement. A lot of these museums which showcase these artworks ended up acquiring a lot of these artists and putting them side by side, their global surrealist artworks. I think we don't have a seminal show that happened on Iraqi art. However, Dr. Nada Shabbout, who's in the university in Texas, is a professor, and she's been teaching a great course on modern Arab art and focusing a lot on Iraqi art. So there is a lot that's happening. There's a lot that's going on, but there's still a lot to be done. I'm happy to open the floor to questions, and I'm happy to take as many questions as you want on the subject.
Thank you. This is so rich. So I invite all of our guests to, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat or the Q&A feature on Zoom. I have one about the broader reception of these two groups of artists. It sounds like the group in Baghdad was more or less sanctioned and supported by the government. And then, but I'm really curious about the Cairo group because surrealism in Europe was very much kind of poking at fascists, right, as they are the political leaders of those countries. How did the monarchy, for example, respond to this group in Cairo?
So this is one of the reasons and this slide is very important. Well, this is one of the reasons the inclusion of Mahmoud Said was so important. So Mahmoud Said's sister was married to the king. So it was very, very difficult for them to, he was part of the aristocracy, he was very much part of the royal family, he was very much part of the establishment. So by including him, it made it seem like everything's okay. Do you know what I mean? And there was no rejection and to the artistic movements. However, there wasn't it wasn't like the art and liberty movement was people were excited or people were buying these artworks, but they were happening, the conversations were happening. They had an extremely active publication program. They had 3 magazines they were publishing. The critics were writing about them. The one magazine was called the, which means the development. Another one was called the Risala, the message, and then there was another one called Don Quixote. But so it was a thriving, a very, very thriving group. And like I said, they were in conversation with the global surrealist movement. Lee Miller, Ronald Penrose was part of them. They were all in conversation. They were all exhibiting in Cairo freely. For the Baghdad Modern Art Group, it wasn't sanctioned by the government per se. It only sort of became absorbed by the government following the revolution in 1958, but they started working in 1951 when it was still very much the Hashemite monarchy. If you look at the movement in Egypt that follows and succeeds the Art and Liberty movement, which is called the Contemporary Art Group, they initially started with the surrealist, and they break away, and then they sort of start their own style. But following the 1952 revolution, and they worked in Egypt from 1958 to 1958, they also become sort of very much consumed by the fervor of the revolution and start creating a lot of paintings following revolutionary propaganda.
Mm. Is that why I was interested in this turn to abstraction then? Is that responding to the political shift, or there was a sort of like thinking that representation could only go so far, and so it necessitated a turn to abstraction?
So with Yunan, for example, it was very much following the wars, the Arab-Israeli wars, and it was the lack of ability to express themselves in anything but with the form of abstraction. So this was following the 1956 war, and then there was the 63 war, 67 war. So it was very much following the wars and what was happening with the wars. The abstraction became the sort of the language to use.
Mm. We have an online question which is asking about how the US war on Iraq has affected the Baghdad Art Movement Group. How are you contending with lost archives and lost art, you and scholars who study this movement, in the face of the war there?
So honestly, it's the archive thing is like a big thing, and it's something like I struggle with all the time. So for me personally, my personal archive is very much on modern Egyptian art. I've been trying to amass a huge archive for modern Egyptian art from magazines, publications, and as I mentioned, a lot of them are in Arabic, and some of them are in French, but none of them have been digitized, and I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have. And then like I always like think about like, oh, what if I just put everything I have and then I just put it online, and then but the copyright and all of these laws come into question. And I don't know if I even have the right to do that, but anyone can come access it. For Iraq, it's also the same. It's very problematic because there were a lot of critics, there were a lot of writings, and there were a lot of publications, but they're mainly in Baghdad and in Iraq. But there are people who are trying to preserve it. There are people who are trying to collate it. So I don't think it's all lost and dead, but there are things that definitely have disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't despair that much. I think there are a lot of things that were lost, but there's still a lot of great things out there.
Any other questions?
In fact, fascinatingly enough, if we're talking about the US war on Iraq, a lot of young artists have emerged from modern day Iraq and are having great shows, whether it be in the US or the UK. One of them known as Hayf Kahraman. She's represented by Jack Shaman Gallery. Another artist known as Mohammed Sami, Iraqi artist, Iraqi painter, fantastic painter. He lives in the UK right now and just had a major show at Blenheim Palace. So I think they are definitely the new generation of Iraqi artists, and they're doing so well, so interesting, and there's a massive appetite in the market for them.
Were there, I'm interested in you mentioned, and this is really important for all surrealist groups, really, were like the little magazines and the way that mail spread not only images of artworks, but also political philosophies, poetry, that art criticism, that sort of thing. And so it's exciting to hear you mention that they were sort of a part of that written and published network. Were these artists also, were both art from both of these groups, were they also showing work outside of their country? Were people in Europe seeing these works, people in the
Yeah.
US, people in South
So,
America?
so definitely we know for sure, for example, Ramses Younen was exhibited at one point, was living in Paris and was exhibiting in Paris. A lot of these artists, same thing with Shakir Hassan Said, a lot of them had these connections with France mainly, or Jawad Selim, for example, had a big connection with the UK. His wife was English. He went to Slade for one point of his career. So they were exhibiting, there were these exchanges. It wasn't all in vacuum. However, one of the things that I always struggle with is that when someone tells you, oh, it's so derivative or it's so referencing some European artist. And I think what we forget is that there was no internet at the time. So it was very hard for some of these people to get access or to even think that they're copying or emulating someone else. But it was all based on, like, let's say, oh, I read about this, and then this thought process, and it develops in your own vernacular, your own language. So I don't really think a lot of I really I don't believe in the idea that there was anything derivative about it, but I think it was a lot of global communication. But I can't imagine the pace, because like I said, with the Art and Liberty movement, they met Henin, the founder, who's a thinker, met Breton in 1936. They wrote this manifesto in 1938, responding to the Degenerate Art exhibition in Munich in 1937. So there must have been some form of exchange, but painting wise, not as much as you can see now, not as much as like when you see this appetite for including the global south, which is what these countries are part of, or having these paintings sort of in communication with the global art history. If you were to go and see, for example, the exhibition this year at the Venice Biennale, curated by Adriano Pedrosa, in two sections, for example, all these Arab artists are included that I mentioned are mainly in conversation with Brazilian artists, Indian artists, and it's very interesting because you can really see the similarities and the conversations. And then we didn't get the chance to talk about them, but a lot of like Lebanese female artists had exhibited and worked in the United States extensively in the 60s and 70s and 80s, whether it's Ital Adnan, Huguette Calon, Saliba Douehi. So they weren't all operating in a vacuum, and they were definitely in communication, but not as much as what we see now.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great because I think that's a question that, that assumption of one group of artists is simply influenced by another one it's a colonial one. And it's also one that I remember reading an article by Mary Carmen Ramirez who talks about that exact same question when it comes to conceptual art in Central and South America, and this idea of these um, the artists in South America, Central America were influenced by what was happening in the US, as though it was like literally a top down influence of, of transmission. But what she's actually arguing is these are all happening at the same time, and it's not a one way direction. It's actually it's a circuit through publications of artists traveling, corresponding with each other, works being shown across the globe. And I think this is exactly, what you were just saying, is that it's not uh, this group of artists is influenced by this group of artists, but they're all happening sort of at the same time and circulating with each other.
Because, for example, like if we look at in the Emirates, the father of contemporary art in the Emirates, Hassan al-Sharif, he was doing land art, and he was using art from found objects in the 70s and 80s. And the Emirates of the 70s and 80s is not the Dubai and Abu Dhabi you know now. It was extremely, it was very, very different. So for him to have been producing that kind of contemporary, thought-provoking kind of art, with found objects, with slippers, with something that's not painting, that's non-figurative, which is what would have been very much more the taste. And he was definitely, there was no internet. Like, I think people really don't know that there was no internet. Travel was not as easy as it is now. It wasn't like, oh, I'm just gonna get on a plane and go to the Musée d'Art Moderne and see what's happening there. You know what I mean? It was, people would travel once in their lifetime, you know, and it was a very different time, and I think people forget that.
Mhm. We have a request in the Q&A. If you could type out some of the names of the contemporary Iraqi artists in the
That's
chat. I think some folks would love to follow up on learning more about them.
sorry, I'm technology. How do I do this? Stop share, right? Do I stop share?
You
Type.
can, but down at the bottom of your Zoom should be, oh, you can do it right there. Yep, exactly.
Oh, it's not allowing me to.
Oh, do you see the chat button at the bottom of your screen?
Yes.
If you
Right.
select everyone, and then everyone can see.
Muhammad Sami, who's currently has a show at Blenheim in London, and Have Kahraman, and she's represented by Jack Shaman and has shows regularly. I think she lives in New York. I think those are two very interesting contemporary Iraqi artists to look at.
Great, thank you.
And honestly,
We
if anyone has the chance to go to the Venice Biennale this year, I know not everyone loved it, but I think there was a major championing of a lot of forgotten modernists and female artists, very, very interesting artists. And I think sometimes the exhibition of the Giardini was super special. And definitely shout out to the Egyptian Pavilion. If anyone has the chance,
absolutely.
if everyone has the chance to go to Venice this year.
If only we were all lucky enough. Speaking of traveling being easier, and sometimes it's just so hard to get to these wonderful places.
Yes.
Um, I wonder if you could speak a little bit too about the art market around these works. And you and I were sort of conversing before we started about, you pinpointed, was it 2006 where
So
this.
2006 was the beginning of the art market. Sort of Christie's began creating sales around modern and contemporary Arab, Iranian, and Turkish art. And at the time, it was like really a boom, and it was in Dubai. There was really a financial boom around it. I started really working on it in 2010, so quite early on as well. And unlike, let's say, the global art market, which was impacted by the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, following the financial crisis, the Middle Eastern art market started to feel the effect in around 2011, 2012, mainly following the Arab Spring. So that was when we had like a mini shift in the art market. In the beginning, there was a lot of speculation, there was a lot of flipping, there were a lot of people who would come in and say, "Oh, I'm gonna buy it," because at the end there's a lot of oil money that's gonna come in, and that they're gonna buy this art eventually. But it sort of calibrated around 2015, 2016, and the market's still very much the same. There's a massive appetite for modernist artists pre-1980s, the massive market share being held by modern Egyptian and Iraqi artists. They demand sort of the highest price in the market. Mahmoud Saeed being the most expensive Egyptian artist sold. Mahmoud Sabri, who we did not mention, is also the highest Iraqi artist, modernist Iraqi artist. And then coming in third is Etel Adnan, who is a Lebanese contemporary artist, which I'm sure all of you guys, she needs little or no introduction. Fantastic artist as well. But that's very much, I think, how the market is governed. I'd say 80% of the value is still in modernist, and 20% is in the contemporary art market. But it's not a market that's flippable. It's not like a market where you see like American or Western contemporary, where there are hot artists and you'll buy them and you'll flip them. A lot of the contemporary artists are very much institutional. A lot of the work is research-based, so it becomes very hard to translate in a market sort of perspective, where the market's
Mm-hmm.
huge appetite for painting, which is what you see in the modernist section.
Mm-hmm. Are there, now that you just mentioned specifically painting, did sculpture, aside from the monument that you showed us in architecture, does sculpture play a role in these two groups otherwise? Are they
In
mostly
the groups,
painters?
in the groups, no, but in the countries, absolutely.
Mhm.
Mahmoud, in Egypt, there's a very famous sculptor known as Mahmoud Mukhtar, whose formative education was in France. He creates seminal sculptures, and a lot of these sculptures can be seen throughout Cairo and Alexandria up to this day. Massive, massive sculptures, and he loved to say that I am the first sculptor following the pharaohs in Egypt. So I'm the first modern sculptor following the pharaohs, because we have this divide in sort of the history of sculpture in Egypt. We have the pharaohs, where we really don't know who created these specific massive monuments. But then we have Mahmoud Mukhtar, and the most famous one is the Renaissance of Egypt, which is in front of the University of Cairo University, where, and I'll write his name down for everyone interested. And it becomes the first example of public art where the entire population supports. He fundraises for the sculpture to be made through a campaign on the news, in the national newspaper, where the Egyptian public contributes to creating the sculpture.
Great. We'll definitely look up that too, because I think it'll just be another way to sort of round out this, this visual vernacular you're talking about tonight.
And if anyone's interested, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to discuss modern Arab art at any point. It's literally like a semester worth of education. Like I'm giving you basic stuff. There are, it's a, like, you can start with the Casablanca school in the 60s in Morocco. In Egypt, there are maybe like 6 groups and different artists to go through: Lebanon, Palestine, Saudi Arabia right now, the Emirates, Iraq, Iran. We didn't even touch upon Turkey, so there's a lot.
We do have a question about Turkey, actually. And the request is if you could talk a little bit about Turkish artists during the same time period, and if there are any of the names that our attendees could look up.
Yes, for sure. There's an artist who I'm a big fan of. Her name is Fakhr Nissa Zaid. I'm gonna write her name because the way I say it sometimes. And she had she had 2 shows, one at the Tate and one at the Deutsche Bank in Germany. Super interesting artist. She was born in Princess Island in Istanbul, educated in Turkey, marries someone actually from the Iraqi royal family. They end up living in exile in Paris, because, as we know, the Iraqi royal family gets killed during the revolution, and they end up living in exile in the other Hashemite kingdom, which is in Jordan. She is a master of abstraction and very much works with the École de Paris artists, and you can see a lot of her works in Paris, in Istanbul, and in the rest of the Arab world as well. Super interesting artist. Um, really embraced every single movement at the time. Found objects. She had this body of work which we don't really see, where when she was living in Paris, she used to collect chicken bones from her neighbors, and she used to create these resin sculptures using chicken bones. A lot of her work also, her abstract work, her kaleidoscopic works, are super interesting, very much on par with the 1950s Parisian art scene. And then her late period, which is her 80s period, which is when she was living in exile in Amman, she goes to portraiture and she creates these like extremely elaborate portraits. She also recently had a show, a retrospective in Abu Dhabi. Super interesting artist, definitely worth exploring.
Thank you.
Time is
And then we have another question about the training of these artists that you spoke about tonight. Are they learning through like an atelier model, or are they going through formal traditional art schools? How are they getting their training?
So it just depends, and it varies from artist to artist. So some of them went. So in Egypt, the first art school was founded in 1921, where And then in Iraq, the art school was founded in the 1940s. So a lot of them had gone to schools on scholarship, whether it be in Paris, the UK, or Italy. So a lot of their education was there. For the Iraqi first generation, for example, their formative education was in Turkey as well. So it really, it's a case by case thing. Mahmoud Said, who's considered the founder of modern Egyptian art, was a judge and had no formative education and was self-taught and sort of went to the Académie Julian in Paris and started teaching himself. So it really depends from a case by case basis. But the schooling, the first school was in Egypt for art, for the arts, and you see it happening all across the world, all across the region as well. And a lot of them had the atelier model, and a lot of them had like the proper art school sort of painting method. But right now, what we really lack and what's the biggest problem we see in our art schools is the they're excellent painters, but it's there's not enough discussion or discourse sort of happening. It's very much
Mhm.
focused on being a perfect painter, so you can execute perfectly, but you're not tested on pushing on breakthrough thought.
Mhm. We have another question, and I think not to speak on behalf of the our guest, but I think this question is about the influence that ancient Egyptian art had on these modern art movements, and that's an interesting question because you sort of pointed toward the Baghdad art group as very much, very deliberately and carefully threading that needle and bringing those in conversation. But it doesn't seem like we see that so much in Cairo. Is that true?
Yes and no, because the movement I talk about is like a secondary movement in Cairo. So the pioneers referenced a lot of the pharaonic elements and sort of because they had this romanticized version. The art and liberty movement were rejecting this romantic version. Mahmoud Mukhtar, the sculptor that I mentioned, used a lot of references to the massive sculptures that we see that were pharaonic in style, but using contemporary or at the time modern Egyptian peasant women as part of his narrative. So it's not sort of so alien. And then Mahmoud Mosaid, who I also reference as the artist they used as the most important artist, the father of modern Egyptian art. His most interesting period is called the Amarna period. The Amarna period is the kingdom in ancient Egypt, and he doesn't paint anything necessarily that has to do with ancient Egypt, but in the backdrop of every single painting, you would see sort of a landscape of Egypt on the Nile with maybe a temple, maybe not, and that's a reference to the pharaonic heritage. There is going to be a show in 2025 at the Met, if I'm not mistaken. And there's going to be a fantastic Mahmoud Said on view from the Amarna period. I think the show is about the influence of pharaonic art on Black art in America, if I'm not mistaken. But I know for sure that there's a Mahmoud Said that's going on loan, and it's a fabulous Mahmoud Said.
Fantastic. Well, we'll all be looking forward to this show. Thanks for giving us the insider tip. Well,
But
Maya, I know it's, go ahead.
please feel free to reach out and please feel free to ask me questions anytime. Kara has my email. I'm happy to discuss anything and talk about anything. And I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope it wasn't just too much information that I was just saying. That maybe I knew more and I wasn't sort of breaking it down even further than I should have.
I think you gave us a really gentle way into a lot of material, and I think we're all really excited to just start Googling all of these names and build up our knowledge bases. We'll get nowhere as close to as knowledgeable as you are, but you gave us a boost.
Thank, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mai. This is really, really wonderful. You're welcome back at the studio school anytime.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great night, and thank you all for attending and your wonderful questions.
Sorry